Hello, my name is Ethan Pelland, and I am responding to Illona's, sorry if I said your name wrong, response to whether or not the United States, which debate for whether or not the United States was correct to use the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. And I'm responding to her taking the pro side, and I'll be responding with partially a con side. So first, it seemed like a kind of general theme of her discussion, which I think is true, is that hindsight is 2020, and that we're able to look back now with having full kind of understanding of everything that happened and access to declassified documents and access to military records, that we're able to have more insight than the military generals were at the time. But I think if we're discussing this from a moral standpoint, whether or not in the end it was the right decision, I think it's still correct to think about it from the perspective with all the information we have. So that was just one thing I wanted to get how to spell or talk about to start out. In response to her more specific points, she brought up kind of what seemed like a more justification in terms of us being attacked first at Pearl Harbor, and I wanted to discuss that notion. Is that in terms of Pearl Harbor, it is true Japan had started the war by launching the attacks on Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor represented a legitimate military target. Pearl Harbor was the base of our operations in the Pacific, and the Japanese they wanted to launch an invasion of the Pacific and of East Asia, and they wanted to make sure that the United States military and by extension the United States Navy and Pearl Harbor would be unable to counter that. So they wanted to disable our resources and logistics at Pearl Harbor. So yes, it was a unprovoked attack, but it was an attack on a military target. And whereas Hiroshima and Nagasaki were civilian targets, they were cities. And obviously, yes, of course, they had, logistical infrastructure and military, and there was some military targets there, but by extension, there were not nearly as many civilian deaths at Pearl Harbor as there were at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one more point in terms of, they started the war at Pearl Harbor, so we had to end the war, was that by this point in the war, 1945, Japan had already suffered the annihilation of almost every city and hundreds of thousands of civilians. Actually, it's estimated that between 550,000 and 800,000 civilians died in Allied bombing attacks against Japan. And even their capital, Tokyo, had been virtually razed to the ground in a firebombing campaign. And so by that point, Japan had already suffered enormously. So enormous destruction of their country, starvation, and so they had already suffered a lot. So I don't think by that point it really mattered that, okay, they started the war, we had to end it, so therefore we were morally justified to drop the bomb. And also by that point, yes, the Japanese military did say that they were going to continue fighting the war. But by that point in 1945, Japan had virtually lost nearly every territory in the Pacific that they had gained, and only still controlled mainly territories like Indochina, Korea, and Manchuria that were more so connected to the mainland. But they didn't control they had no more access to oil, because they had lost the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, in 1944. So they essentially they didn't have the resources anymore or the strength to launch invasions or to launch offensive measures. They were purely trying to hold on to the last few territories they think they could have and defend their mainland. And then, in fact, that by that point they'd even lost Okinawa and Iwo Jima, which were two territories which before the Japanese expansion were always traditionally considered to be part of the just Japan itself. Not like territories they had seized in during any of their wars of expansion. And so they were not in any position to be really a threat to the United States and our interests in the region. And as well, I would say that it less so was the bombs and more so the entrance of the Soviet Union that caused the military to realize that they could no longer hold on to power in the country. And before this, the Soviet Union had been a neutral party, had not participated in any attacks, last that I know of, on Japan by air, by sea, or by land. But with the entrance of the Soviet Union, it meant that the Japanese actually, there was a country that could invade them from both sides. So they faced by that point, the strongest militaries in the world, and other than Britain, the two strongest navies in the world. And so they weren't in any position to face both the Soviet Union and the United States. So I would say that there should be more credit given to the Soviet Union entering the war for being credit for ending the war. And then kind of a final point is the notion that to end the war, strong resistance was required. I certainly agree. I think the military is very fanatic. They would not have surrendered unless something extraordinary had happened. And also that the Soviet Union needed to send a message that after the war, Japan would be our sphere of influence and not Soviet Union's. So I think a message could have been sent with the nuclear bombs in a much different fashion with a lower cost of life. If you had invited a delegation of stakeholders in the region, so different groups in the Pacific, countries in the Pacific, and then the Soviet Union and Japan, have a delegation observe, say, a controlled demolition of an uninhabited island or a mountain or some type of territory in Japan that does not place hundreds of thousands of civilians at risk of death, and also does not irradiate two cities. So you could have done a controlled demolition, had them present, seen the massive destruction, and realized, okay, they can literally annihilate our entire country with these bombs. And so I think you could have used the atomic bombs in a different way that did not cost as many civilian deaths.